It was a very emotional apology, but also a full one. Pope Francis said he was sorry and asked for forgiveness in the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system. Now, to talk about this in more detail is political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, while the Prime Minister and Governor General were there, we did not really hear from them. Was there a reason for that?
The reason was to put the focus on the apology. This was a long time coming. Although this trip, by the way, was put together rather quickly. It wasn't planned for earlier this year. And this is the type of trip that normally is planned out over years. And instead, it was put together in months. Pope Francis meeting with several survivors of residential schools back in April at the Vatican, where he gave them a private apology. You know, they all talked about it and described how heartfelt and full it was. But there were calls that he had to do a full public apology on Canadian soil. And so, yes, while this is a state visit, the Pope is the head of the Vatican, which is a nation state, smallest one on the planet, but it is one. Um, the Prime Minister and the Governor General have just taken on roles of observers, of greeting him when he arrived at Edmonton International Airport, but not really, taking any of the spotlight away from where it should be, and that is on Pope Francis offering an apology in person to residential school survivors. I watched the entire thing. I was more emotional than I thought watching him look out over the graveyard, which is, has been a community graveyard in Mascowis for a long time, but is also the resting place for some residential school students who didn't make it home. So he prayed over the graves. He met with survivors. He partook in ceremonies. They gave him, a war bonnet, a headdress. It was all very moving, very emotional, very filled with faith, saying that the church had lost its way. It did not live up to the gospel in the way that people were treated. It's been a long time since we've seen that much prayer on national secular news networks as we saw on Monday, but very moving, Hal.
Now, the Pope's trip continues this week, Brian, as he leaves Alberta for Quebec and Iqaluit. Will it be a similar theme, or will the tour become a little more political?
Well, it will still maintain a similar theme. The focus is on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. There is a bit of a meeting with secular political leaders when he's in Quebec City, but he is also participating in more ceremonies with Indigenous leaders in Quebec, and then, of course, in Iqaluit, where he'll meet with Inuit members and survivors of residential schools. So it will take on a little bit more of a political meeting. I think there might be a bit more of a photo op with the Prime Minister while he's in Quebec City. I'm sure that Premier Francois Legault, who's up for re-election, will try and make sure that he gets a photo with Pope Francis as well. But for the most part, this is very different than any other papal visit that we've had before. This is the fourth one, and they tend to be, you think of World Youth Day, thousands of youth coming around the world, and huge rallies and masses and expressions of faith. This is a very different one, very somber, which I think is appropriate given the subject.
Brian, farmers across Canada, especially here on the prairies in the West, are really concerned about a push to reduce fertilizer emissions from the Trudeau government. Walk us through this. Now, the government says it's voluntary and it's not about reducing fertilizer, but our farmers say otherwise, and they're really upset. What's the truth here?
Well, the truth is that right now it is voluntary, but farmers rightly believe that they will make it mandatory. This is something the Trudeau government has been talking about for a while. They want an absolute 30% emissions reduction from fertilizer. So right now they're saying it's voluntary. If they can't get agreements in consultations that are ongoing right now, at some point it will become a mandatory program. Now, the government says this isn't about cutting fertilizer use, but the farmers I'm talking to, both here in Ontario, where they're very concerned about it as well, but across the prairies, the farmers I'm talking to, the industry groups say you can't cut emissions by 30% without cutting fertilizer at this point. There is, there is a different type of fertilizer. It's not up to scale yet, that doesn't have the emissions of nitrous oxide, which is what the government's concerned about. They say there's a greenhouse gas that has to be controlled, but that leaves microplastics in the soil. So, it's a bit of back and forth, but the farmers are effectively right. they are being told to cut emissions by 30%, which means a reduction in fertilizer by 30%, which means lower yields. And they say, and anybody you talk to, including my colleague Anthony Furey, spoke to someone who was in the Ontario Liberal government working for the agriculture minister. And so they're liberal, and they're saying, look, we already have the cleanest, most sustainable growing methods and use of fertilizer methods in the world. We can't do this without reducing things. They're already following best practices. Can you improve them? Always. But that's what farmers are trying to do. But the government is pushing something that farmers say simply won't work.
Last week, Federal Agriculture Minister Marie-Claude Bibeau met in Saskatoon with her provincial colleagues, Brian, many of whom left feeling quite angry over this very issue. What transpired?
Well, I think they were looking for a bit of flexibility when Minister Bibeau went to Saskatoon. And instead, they got no flexibility. Statements issued by Alberta's agriculture minister, Nate Horner, Saskatchewan's David Merritt, they actually put out a joint news release saying that these targets are wrong, that they're arbitrary goals. Lisa Thompson, the agriculture minister for here in Ontario, also putting out a statement saying that this is the wrong way to go, that she was disappointed that there wasn't any flexibility. There didn't seem to be any room for maneuvering, that the federal government, as I said, they're claiming it's voluntary. They're claiming they're having consultations, but the ministers are not seeing it that way. And by the way, those three agriculture ministers that I just mentioned, Horner, Merritt, and Thompson, they were all successful farmers or ranchers before going into politics. Right. Still have the operations for at least two of them, I believe. Marie-Claude Bibeau was a bureaucrat. She was an international development bureaucrat before this. So, who do you want to believe? Somebody who knows how to work the soil, or somebody who doesn't know what crop she's driving by as she goes to her home in the eastern townships of Quebec?
Or somebody who actually knows how to drive a combine, right, or a tractor.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, speaking of which, a number of farmers here on the prairies have been supporting their brethren in places like the Netherlands, where their governments are also calling for reduction in fertilizer. Now, it's not just in the Netherlands, but apparently farmers are also protesting in Sri Lanka. So it's not just in Canada, but around the world.
This is kind of part of the global movement for meeting Paris climate targets, and different governments have taken different approaches, but they want to see fertilizer use reduced. As I said, we already have the cleanest measures, the cleanest ways of doing it, the most responsible and sustainable ways of doing it in this country. Sri Lanka went to an absolute extreme, and they banned the use of synthetic fertilizers. That saw a 20% reduction in their rice crop. They had a reduction in tea production, which is a major source of income for that island nation. So there were real problems there. In the Netherlands, what we've seen with Dutch farmers is they've been mandated, it's not voluntary, mandated a 50% reduction. Wow. So, what we saw in Sri Lanka with the overthrow of the government was partially related to the fertilizer issue, an awful lot of other economic issues plaguing that country as well. But in the Netherlands, what we're seeing is directly the same policy idea. They've taken it a step further, 50% instead of 30, mandatory instead of voluntary for now. And Dutch farmers are saying that this is one of the country's main economic drivers, and the government is on a collision course to try and derail it. So they're pushing back. I think we will start seeing more protests, not to the point that we saw in Sri Lanka, but we will see more protests across the country as more people learn about this and decide that they've got to fight back, because the Trudeau government isn't listening, despite saying they're in consultation.
Brian, the Commons Public Safety Committee heard from Bill Blair and RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki after allegations of political interference in the investigation of the Nova Scotia mass shooting back in April of 2020. They also heard from those who were working in the investigation who had a very different story. Who should we believe?
I say we believe the people that came up from Nova Scotia. If you remember, this came about because of handwritten notes taken by the man who was the face, the public face of the investigation back in April 2020, a guy named Superintendent Darren Campbell. And he took notes after a rather abruptly called and tense conference call with RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, where she expressed how disappointed she was that at that point in April of 2020, that the Nova Scotia team had not released the types of guns, the caliber of guns used in the mass shooting. And she told them that she had promised the public safety minister, Bill Blair, that this would be released and that it was all related to pending gun control legislation. Of course, just days later, on May 1st, 2020, we saw the government establish their list and institute an immediate ban on using 1,500 different types of rifles and shotguns in Canada. So, was there political interference? Bill Blair wants to tell you no. Bill Blair says he never asked anybody to do this. Brenda Lucki is kind of in the middle. She says that, yeah, she did tell them that it would be there. She doesn't remember using the word promise, but every single other person on that call in Nova Scotia heard her say it was a promise, heard her say that she was being pressured by the minister's office and the PMO, heard her say that this was related to gun control legislation. So you've got a whole room full of people, and the only ones that are saying this didn't happen or they can't recall are people in Ottawa, very political people. I'm not buying the Liberal spin on this. I'm not buying Brenda Lucki's spin. She's a politician, just like Bill Blair, who I covered when he was Toronto police chief, and who's got a record that I don't think he should be as proud of as he is. He was throwing that around a lot yesterday. I don't believe him as a minister or as a former police officer.
Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper has made it official. He's thrown his support behind Pierre Poilievre to become the next leader of the federal Conservatives. Now, Brian, were you surprised by this? And how much will it really help Poilievre?
That second part's an open question, but was I surprised? I'm not surprised that Stephen Harper is backing Pierre Poilievre. I think everybody knew that. I laughed a little bit in Harper's video that he posted online, making the endorsement official, where he said, people have been wondering. No, nobody was wondering. Everyone knew. Look, I'd been told back in June, watch out for Stampede. When Stampede comes along, you might see Stephen Harper put his arm around Pierre Poilievre and endorse him. It might happen in person. This is something to keep an eye out for. Then about a week or so before Stampede, I was told, no, that's not going to happen. He's going to stay out of it at this point. He's not going to make any announcements. So, people that are following this knew where Stephen Harper stood. He was backing Pierre Poilievre. He does not like Jean Charest. But it's odd that it came out now. I'm not sure that Poilievre needs it now. Maybe it's an attempt to speak to the existing 140,000 members that were there before all the sign up, try and get the mainstream establishment members of the party to back Pierre because some of them were not. Maybe it's an attempt just to motivate or demotivate Jean Charest and his team. Charest and his team trying to put the best spin forward on this, and they're saying, look, we're still in the race, and this shows that the Poilievre camp must be panicking if they've got to pull out the Stephen Harper endorsement card. Not a few political observers wondered if that was part of it. So I'm not surprised. I'm just not sure how it plays out. This is such an opaque system of voting that you don't really know what's going on. Poilievre's still expected to win. Does this help him win on the first ballot? Maybe it does. Maybe that's part of the strategy here.
Brian, inflation continues to spiral out of control. We're now over 8%. Do the Trudeau Liberals actually have a plan to help make life a little more affordable for Canadian families?
A poll out by the Meru Group researchers last week said that majority of Canadians don't think that the Prime Minister has a plan. Never mind a good plan or a bad plan, they just don't think he has a plan at all. And having watched him and listened to him, I have to agree. I mean, he keeps coming back to the issue of we're lowering your childcare fees. He's been saying that since inflation really became a big issue last August for this government. Look, if you've got kids in daycare, yeah, that program's going to help and you're going to see your fees reduced. Maybe you've gotten a rebate check depending on where you live in the country and how your local government is implementing this. But if you've got older kids who aren't in daycare anymore, maybe they're 10, not fully grown like yours or mine, but your kids are 10, they're not going to daycare. That's not helping you. You're a senior. That's not helping you. You're single. You don't have kids. That's not helping you. It doesn't reduce the cost of gas. It doesn't reduce the cost of housing. It doesn't reduce the cost of groceries, which we all know have gone up tremendously. So, no, the prime minister just simply doesn't have a plan to deal with this. He thinks that it's all on the Bank of Canada. We've had RBC, uh, BMO, Scotiabank, academic economists like Ian Lee all step forward and say, look, the government spending is contributing to inflation. The last thing Justin Trudeau wants to do is reduce spending. In fact, David Dodge, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, said the government's having a windfall right now due to inflation. You know, gas taxes are up, GST revenue is up, so they're doing really well. He called on them. He said, "Don't spend the surplus that you're pulling in right now because that will generate more inflation. You know, it'll be awful for the economy." So everybody but the Trudeau Liberals say they've got a role to play, that they should be doing something. They don't seem to believe that at all.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.